So thank you very much for joining us here on Spark. I'm really glad to say that I have Paul Taylor here from Bromford today joining us to talk about his experience in innovation. So Paul, first could I just ask you to tell us a little bit about what Bromford does and what your role is?
Okay, well, Bromford would be known traditionally as a housing association. We provide housing, affordable housing for a range of people. It could be housing for sale, it could be housing for rent, to a very, very broad range of customers across the Midlands and Central England. My role is innovation coach. I'm part of an innovation lab that we set up about 3 years ago now, specifically to look at how the organisation could think more creatively around the problems that it's got.
If I can ask you first, what is innovation to you?
Innovation to me, I mean, there's three components to it for me. One is having an idea, a new idea, essentially, doing something different. The second part of it, though, is actually doing it and executing it. And this is the most important part, because most people confuse innovation as just having ideas. So the second part is actually doing it and executing on it. And the third bit is that it delivers some value. Okay, either to customers, to colleagues, to stakeholders, to partners, to whoever, it doesn't matter who, it makes a difference. And those three things, that's to me innovation. Innovation isn't necessarily big, massive things, it's not necessarily technology based. It could be for people, it could be processes, it could be quite small things. But actually, if you put those things together, do something new, execute it, it creates value, that's innovation.
First, if I can just ask you a little bit around culture, because we often talk about sometimes culture can be almost a barrier to innovation. How important do you think it is to have a culture which encourages innovation?
Well, I think it is really important to have a culture that promotes innovation, but we have to accept that most of our organisations are built to execute and deliver things very well, okay? So they're built to be reliable, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. Innovation is slightly different to that, because innovation means messing around with that formula, okay? It means actually changing things and doing things differently. It's not business as usual, it's not the day-to-day, and that's why sometimes there's a clash between within the culture of business as usual and innovation.
So, given that sort of clash and sort of trying to simultaneously keep good service going on and delivery while trying to take a different approach, do you think it's a little bit about how do you try and marry that Twintrack approach in an organisation?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the leadership thing comes in, that is just absolutely so important, because a lot of people say to me, well, our organisation's bad at innovation, and what you'll often find is that's right, because you're designed to be bad at innovation, because as I've said, you're designed to execute and to do things reliably. So what you have to create is a culture where people recognise the difference. People recognise that we do need to do our business as usual and to deliver to customers and to deliver value to them, but we also need to reserve some of that for thinking differently. So the culture needs to be something that actually recognises there's an inherent conflict and recognises actually that we'll need to be flexible in our approach about how we do those two things.
I think you kind of touched there on how sometimes in an organisation there's kind of this opposition to innovation as such. It's seen as you're making my job a bit tougher.
Yep.
What are some of the ways that you try to overcome those sort of barriers?
Yeah. Okay. Well, my view is that everybody's open ultimately to innovation. Nobody comes into a job to say they want to do it for the next 5, 10, 20 years in exactly the same way. Nobody's born that way. What happens though is that people get measured on performance in a certain way, they're expected to deliver in a certain way, and over time that's how they start to deliver, and that's what they respond to. So how you can start overcoming that is by having conversations with people about the kind of ideas you've got, about what you could do differently, and giving them space sometimes to think about actually how would they approach that, and to do it in a kind of safe way. So not just to let them go off and do it, essentially. That's not innovation. Innovation is about thinking about the problem you're trying to solve and then applying some creativity and then testing some things out.
If I may, I'd like to switch on to collaboration. and particularly looking at how you interact with your customers as a way to innovate and to deliver more.
Yeah.
So why do you think this is so important for Bromford?
Well, for Bromford, we provide housing that ultimately a lot of those are owned by us. We need customers to look after our properties. We need customers to work well within their communities and not fall out with each other. So understanding customers and their behaviours and the problems they've got and how we can help them is absolutely everything that we need to do. If we don't care or understand what's going on from customers, we feel we'll have a less healthy organisation, and we'll spend a lot of time either chasing customers for payments or actually running around after customers' problems, dealing with lots of complaints, all of those kind of things. So innovation is a step beyond just thinking about complaints. Innovation is about actually practically understanding the problems that customers have got and thinking about how you can resolve them. Problems they might not even realise they have got as well. That's really important, particularly when you look at things like affordability, customers' ability to pay bills and things like that. Those are big sort of issues for us. So getting to know the customer, beyond just doing surveys though, beyond just actually, a tick box exercise to say, are you satisfied with the services you're getting from us? The really good organisations that I admire around innovation have an implicit understanding of their customers' needs and their customers' desires, and then they build things around that essentially. So for me, yeah, it's massively important. And the other thing is around changing customers' behaviours, whether that's about changing attitudes towards the environment in terms of actually how they look after a property, how they consume water, for example, things like that. If you want to change your customers' behaviours, you're going to have to absolutely implicitly understand where they're coming from.
Do you think that that is something which is especially important when it comes to dealing with customers who are in vulnerable circumstances?
I don't think it's necessarily especially important for vulnerable customers. I think it applies to any customer, essentially, because, as customers, as all of us as customers, are quite complex creatures, and we're not necessarily in this category one day and we stay there for the rest of our lives. I could be a vulnerable customer tomorrow, essentially, depending on what happens in my life. And I think particularly when you look at sort of financial circumstances and customers' ability to pay and afford for things, that can change. So I think you absolutely need to be especially aware of the needs of vulnerable customers, but actually I don't think that means that you need a different approach in terms of listening to them or in terms of innovating with them.
Then, in terms of your experience, so you've been talking about how this has become really central to what you do here at Bromford. What are some of the big lessons that you feel like you've learned in terms of how you can really identify your customers, how you can really connect with them?
I mean, the first thing is, if we look back to where we were as an organisation, we weren't particularly good at problem definition. And problem definition is the boring bit of innovation, but it's the absolutely central bit. And it's the bit most people skip. They go straight to post-it notes and bean bags and all those kind of things, and they don't really nail the problem. So, the big important lesson for us to learn is about what's the problem we're trying to fix here, and let's nail that and properly understand it before we go about having loads and loads of ideas, because if we don't do that, we risk solving the wrong problem.
In terms of when we're looking to solve these sort of problems, sometimes there's a little bit of hesitancy to sort of get stuck in, because ultimately there's kind of a feel that there's some uncertainty. There's a huge amount of, it's a very fast changing world at the moment. So I did a bit of an open question for you. Do you think that there's a perfect time to innovate?
I don't think there is a perfect time, because it depends very much on the context of the problem, essentially. Usually, and this is quite a difficult one to answer, because in one sense, if you've got like an emergency, a burning platform with your organisation, in one sense, culturally, it's a great time to shift to doing something different, because you can get buy-in straight away. So if an industry or organisation is in trouble, it's really easy to get people on board. Problem is, you're probably going to panic mode, essentially. So you'll be running around doing things and they won't always be the right thing. So the perfect time to innovate is actually when you don't feel you need to, essentially. The perfect time to innovate and build an approach to innovation is when you can take time to think about things and you can put the kind of structures into place, get people on board, get buy-in for things, where people aren't running around all the time. So, it's a bit of a paradox, because actually that is the perfect time probably for most organisations to innovate, but for most organisations it's probably the time that they think we don't need to.
So, given there isn't necessarily a perfect time to innovate, or potentially that time to innovate is when you least expect it, do you think innovation purely comes in the form of, this big bang, the iPhone as such?
I mean, there are, that sort of big bang disruptive innovation is very rare. But unfortunately, it's what most of us look up to. That's what we should be aiming for, the next iPhone or whatever. And it's highly unlikely, even for an organisation like Apple, are going to go into a big bang. So, for most of us, it's not. For most of us, it's going to be a period of incremental innovation. And that is usually the right thing to do, because you sort of get the sort of better result in the longer term. And so it's not thinking of it as in, we've got to innovate within the next 6 months. It's thinking about actually, what you need to do and then slowly doing it. An example I always use is, the whole, the Heinz tomato ketchup bottle, and in terms of the problem people had in terms of getting it out and using the knife to get it out of the bottle. But they finally solved it like 100 years later. That's how long it actually took through stages of incremental innovation to actually turn the bottle upside down, turn it to plastic, make it squeezable, change the consistency of the tomato ketchup. So it wasn't a big bang. It might look like a big bang, but there was lots going on behind the scenes. There are some things that you can make very, very quick changes to, absolutely, but actually they tend to be a rarity.
One of the things that sometimes stops people from innovating, beyond just sort of incremental versus big bang and sort of thinking you have to come up with the iPhone every time, is they talk about there being a lot of risks and barriers to innovation. One of those that's often mentioned is regulation. Do you think that innovation and regulation can kind of work together to deliver more benefits for customers?
I think it can. I think that the impact of regulation is often overstated, and it's sometimes used as an excuse not to do things differently. I've met a lot of regulators, and I've never met a regulator who doesn't want to inspire innovation within their particular sector. So I think it's around, absolutely, if it's just about, coming up with a wacky idea and pitching it to the regulator, they're probably going to think, what are they on about here? What are they doing? If it's based in evidence, both in terms of the problem and how you've begun to explore it, regulators will listen without doubt, because they want to improve things for everybody ultimately. So again, the regulator's probably not going to be as entranced by the big bang type innovation. They're probably going to be more open to sort of incremental innovation. But it all comes down to what I talk about, evidence base as well. And if you can show actually with evidence that you're delivering better value for your customers, show me a regulator who's going to be against that.
So Paul, a lot of people talk about, in terms of innovation, that it feels like such a big concept and it can be a little bit overwhelming at times. What would be some of your advice to someone who's just sort of starting innovation? Where do you start?
I mean, once you've absolutely identified what the problem is and you've got some ideas around it, the principal thing to do is to start as small as possible, okay? Because if you start small, it takes all the risk out of innovation. Because innovation, by its nature, is risky, okay? So accept that and make your testing, your experiment, whatever you want to do, as small as possible, So we've launched, multi-million-pound new services that started by just taking people out of their role for 2 or 3 days. That's all. Not, big projects that need a lot of management. Start very small, because if you're doing innovation correctly, it's going to be a period of iteration. So it's never going to work first time. It'd be very, very unusual if something you did work first time. So there's no point in making a case for lots of resources or anything, because you simply won't need them and you shouldn't need them. And having resources too early means actually that you're going to be wasting money completely. So that's my first sort of tip on that. The other thing is around, expect failure. And this is where there's a leadership role within that, As I've said, it would be highly unlikely for things not to work, but innovation works when you don't just fail and walk away and give up. It's when you keep going at it and you keep pushing at it. So it's very much about start small, expect failure, but actually keep at it and keep iterating. And that, as I say, manages a lot of the risk for you as well.
So I'd like to ask you, final question for you, I'm sure you'd be relieved to hear, is what would be your one big message for anyone on their journey of innovation from yours?
My big message would be not to overthink it, and not to make it over complex, and not to actually be put off by how other people define innovation, even though I've defined it myself. But what I said was it's absolutely that. It's having a new idea, or maybe an old idea that can be applied in a new way. It's around doing it. It's around testing something, and it's about then demonstrating it's got value. And if you start on those things, we can all do lots of experiments every day. In that sense, we don't need a big kind of innovation program or an innovation lab. All we need to develop is like permission within our teams or our permission with our managers to actually give us a little bit of space for things not to work. And once you've done that, start with that essentially, things will grow from there.
I think that's a fantastic message to finish on, all around creating space, which will lead to better innovation. And so thank you very much for all of you for watching Spark today, and thank you very much, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you.